Welcome to Miyconst Hardware. My previous attempt to build a tiny X99 gaming PC was not very successful. I used a low-profile chassis with a micro-ITX motherboard and horrible airflow. Even though I managed to fix the airflow and the components were cooled properly, the final price was too high and overall the build didn't make much sense. This time I decided to go with an ultra-budget configuration, so here are my components. Motherboard Machinist X99 PR9 for about 60 euros, CPU Xeon E5-2640 V4 for about 10 euros, memory 2 sticks 8GB each, DDR4 2133 15 euros, CPU cooler, I just took something from the shelf I had, but let's say 15 euros. SSD 512GB Samsung M.2 NVMe from the second-hand market for about 30 euros, GPU Gigabyte GTX 1660 Super, also from the second-hand market for about 90 euros. For the power supply, I picked a Sharkoon Silent Storm SFX 450 watt for about 60 euros from a store. And for the chassis, I 3D printed MODCASE Evolution Mini-ITX version. For the plastic, screws, and the power extension and USB extension cables, I paid about 40 euros total. So the final price of this build is somewhere around 320 euros. The MODCASE Evolution chassis deserves some extra info. This chassis is designed for 3D printing and available in 3 sizes: Micro-ITX, Mini-ITX and APU. For the sake of compatibility with the small printers, the Micro-ITX version is split into 4 corner pieces, while the Mini-ITX is split into 2 halves. After printing both of these, I have to say that I prefer the Mini-ITX layout much more. With just 2 pieces to connect, there are fewer screws required and there are less places for misalignment. Thus, I would really like to see Micro-ITX version in 2 halves for larger printers. In general, I'm very happy with the chassis and the documentation, but several important adjustments were required for my project. First, Machinist X99 PR9 is not Mini-ITX motherboard, it is slightly larger. Even though the chassis has 3 expansion slots, the motherboard does not fit in depth and it collides with the power supply. Luckily for me, Hayden, the designer, responded to my request and provided me with a slightly longer rear half of the chassis, so X99 PR9 fits perfectly. The second major problem occurred when I tried to install power supply. Sharkoon SFX power supply would not fit into this chassis with any of the power extension cables I bought. In the very end, I gave up and used long AIO mounting screws with custom-made washers. It's worth mentioning that power supply installation is also a problem with the Micro-ITX version. I tried all ATX power supplies that I had on hand, and none of them would fit into the chassis without modifications. The slim power extension cable are also not available in Sweden, and AliExpress price, at least with the shipping to Sweden, is ridiculous, so it's kinda a problem. Apart from these 2 major modifications, I have also printed a custom mesh for the rear 92mm fan place. I did not install the fan, so I decided to just cover it up. Also, the vertical base I modified into a single piece instead of the 2 connecting halves. Hayden promised that the single-piece version will be available with the next update. The lack of cable management hooks is another thing that annoys me. I have to route zip ties through the chassis walls if I want some cables to be fixed. It is an okay solution for a black chassis, but it really looks ugly with bright colors. All printing information is available in the chassis documentation, but if you're interested in my particular print, then here are my stats. I used the cheapest PETG plastic that I could find in Sweden, and it costed me about 11–12 euros per kilogram. In total, with my experiments and the vertical base, I used almost 2 kilograms of plastic, actually slightly less than that. Total print time, again with the experiments, was about 2 days or 48 hours. I printed the chassis using my Prusa MK4 printer with input shaping, and the layer height was between 2 and 2.5 mm. I first started printing with the 2 mm layer height, but then switched to 2.5 mm. For the side panels, I use honeycomb pattern with 20% infill. After this print, I have everything tuned in, pre-sliced and configured, so the next chassis should take less plastic and less printing time. Finally, I would like to say thank to Hayden for answering all my questions and providing great support with every issue I have encountered. Now let's see how this tiny PC performs. The E5-2640 V4 I have already tested, and there is a dedicated video about this CPU on my channel, so now I'm going to focus on how this particular PC, equipped with just 16 gigs of RAM in dual-channel memory configuration and a GTX 1660 Super, performs in modern games. All games were tested at 1080p screen resolution, and upscaling was either disabled or render resolution was set to native or 100%. Starting as usual with Assassin's Creed Mirage, using medium preset, this tiny PC produces 74 FPS on average and 56 FPS 1% lows. During the benchmark run, the GPU is almost fully utilized and the CPU load is somewhere between 30–40%. This indicates a well-balanced configuration. The entire system power consumption during the benchmark is only about 205 watts, which I find incredible. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora is a newer and way more demanding game. Here, using the medium preset, we get only 27–33 FPS, and it is safe to assume that GTX 1660 Super is the bottleneck, because the GPU utilization stays at about 99%. Skull and Bones, another recent title that's also very demanding. With a high preset, this PC is almost reaching the 60 FPS mark. The final score is 28–58 FPS. The GPU utilization is mostly above 90%, so GTX 1660 Super is the primary bottleneck again, but a better CPU would help as well. Alan Wake 2 just murders old hardware, and to be honest, here I expected to get stuttery mess, but instead, using the low preset, this budget configuration manages to score 23–29 FPS. Sure, it's not the best result, we are just under the 30 FPS mark, but it is still playable. GTX 1660 Super is the primary bottleneck here, so a better or much better GPU is required for more FPS in this game. F123 is a very well optimized racing game. Using the medium preset, E5-2640 V4 with the GTX 1660 Super combo delivers 146–176 FPS, which is more than enough for comfortable gameplay. The GPU load hovers around 95%, which indicates a good balance between CPU and GPU. Now let's test some shooters, and the first one will be Rainbow Six Extraction. With the medium preset, this PC is good for 96–130 FPS. Both the GPU and CPU are working really hard here. During the benchmark run, GTX 1660 Super is the primary bottleneck though, since the GPU load is around 95–98%. Fortnite is getting ever demanding with each update, and now using the low preset we get only 33–65 FPS. The FPS mark greatly varies depending on the surrounding and the actions around. Nonetheless, the GPU load is mostly between 97 and 99%, and that means that GTX 1660 Super is the primary bottleneck yet again. CS2 or Counter-Strike 2 doesn't have a DirectX 12 support yet, so the CPU performance is much more important here. Even though using the low preset, the PC delivers respectable 74–143 FPS, we can see that the E5-2640 V4 is the major bottleneck here, since the GPU load is often below the 60% mark. The Finals is a much better optimized game, but larger maps and advanced destruction require some serious computing power. E5-2640 V4 gets loaded up to 70% and the GTX 1660 Super up to 100%. Yet with the medium preset we get only 50–70 FPS. It's still very playable, but competitive gamers would most likely want more than that. Lastly, I have also tested Helldivers 2. Much to my surprise, with the 43 FPS 1% low and 79 FPS on average, the game was very playable and enjoyable. Yes, I had to use the low preset, but the game still looks okay and I could play like that all day long. Speaking about CPU and GPU utilization, here we get another example of an almost perfect balance. E5-2640 V4 gets loaded up to 55%, and the GTX 1660 Super is almost fully utilized. For the conclusion, I have to say that I really like this tiny X99 gaming PC. For 320 euros we get very respectable performance with very good power efficiency. At peak, this computer consumes maximum 210 watts of electricity, which I find incredible. Of course, it is also possible to further reduce the price by picking up a second-hand chassis and a second-hand power supply. But I really like this stylish MODCASE Evolution Mini-ITX chassis, and I will certainly use it in my future projects for other builds. I really hope to get a micro ATX version that I can print in two halves, so I can use it for larger motherboards. With that, I have to say thanks for watching, thanks for listening, I hope it was interesting. Bye for now.